Кирилл Флорида, наш гость из Соединенных Штатов Америки, абсолютный чемпион мира Рокки Бальбоа. Заслуженный мастер спорта Иван Драго.
Welcome back, young scholars. In this video, we'll be discussing the Cold War. Oh, I wish it was about Rocky. All right, the big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video. First, what were the major causes of the Cold War? Second, in what different ways was the Cold War expressed? So first, what were the major causes of the Cold War? The US and the Soviets emerged from World War II as the undisputed superpowers. Western Europe had essentially self-destructed by fighting each other in World War I and World War II. These two superpowers, the United States and the Soviets, have dramatically differing views on history, on politics, on economics. The Cold War was a worldwide ideological struggle between the United States, which were proponents of democracy and capitalism and free market economics, and the Soviet Union, which was following a more authoritarian single-party political model and a socialist communist command-style economy. There was state control of land, resources, and the means of production. This is called a Cold War because the US and the USSR never actually engaged in direct military action against one another. They kind of do a lot of squaring up against one another, but they never actually take any swings directly at one another. They do, however, engage in a nuclear race. You can see here the number of nuclear warheads. The United States was first developing the nuclear weapon with the Manhattan Project in World War II. And the United States quickly built up their nuclear arsenal. However, the Soviet Union started developing their own weapons and eventually caught and surpassed the United States in terms of the number of nuclear warheads that they possessed. And since the 1980s, really, there's been a period of attempts at nuclear disarmament. The other area that the United States and the Soviets competed directly with one another in was the space race. So the Soviet Union were the first to launch a satellite into orbit, Sputnik, and then they sent up Sputnik 2, the first to launch an actual dog into space, which tragically never came back. Then the United States followed with the first manned mission to the moon. The United States and the Soviets were also involved in a series of hot wars, also known as proxy wars. They fought in places like Korea and Vietnam and Afghanistan. So we will spend time later in this video and the next video walking through those various proxy wars and explaining the causes, who the participants were, and how those wars eventually reached resolution. So in terms of the causes of the Cold War, the roots really can be traced back to World War II, where the United States and the Soviets were actually in an alliance together. However, the United States and the Soviets had very different experiences in World War II. They had, first of all, some different thoughts on strategy in the war. After the United States gets into the war, Joseph Stalin wants the United States to open up a second front directly in France to relieve some of the pressure on the Soviet Union. The United States does not do so immediately, but instead attacks in North Africa. So almost from the get-go, this alliance was a bit of a strained one. The war was also experienced in very different ways. The United States suffering far fewer casualties in World War II than the Soviet Union, which had over 20 million of its people die in the course of the war. The Soviets suffered far more war deaths, far more damage. The war was fought in Soviet cities like Stalingrad. Many of those cities were bombed out by German aerial firebombing campaigns and a Nazi invasion. Once the war was finished, though, there was a significant question as to what to do with Nazi Germany. You may recall that after World War I, as part of the discussions of the Treaty of Versailles, the various Allied powers decided not to give Germany the ultimate punishment by splitting them up, breaking them apart. But after World War II, Allied powers did decide that that was what needed to happen with Germany. So Germany was divided up into 4 separate occupation zones after World War II. So you had the Soviet occupation zone, the British occupation zone, the American occupation zone, and the French occupation zone. And then notice within the Soviet occupation zone, there also is the city of Berlin, which was divided up into 4 also separate occupation zones: British, French, American, and Soviet. And this becomes important as one of the first events in the Cold War, as when the Soviet Union engaged in a blockade of Berlin, not allowing supplies to be brought into West Berlin. The United States responded with their Berlin airdrop, where they dropped supplies. Stalin had a real choice very early on in the Cold War whether or not he wanted to shoot down some of those American planes. Chose not to, and therefore we again never had that sort of direct confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. At the conclusion of World War II, the Soviet Red Army was controlling nearly all of Eastern Europe, having pushed Nazi forces back into Germany. And at that point, there was a real question as to what the intentions of the Soviets were in Eastern Europe. What the Soviets wanted to get out of Eastern Europe was to have a buffer zone between themselves and the Germans, who, for whatever reason, keep attacking them. They attacked them in World War I, they attacked them in World War II. The Soviets then start to exert essentially a sphere of influence over Eastern Europe, encouraging those countries to follow their lead in the direction of socialism, communism. The United States, in response to all of this, is growing increasingly concerned about the spread of socialism and communism. Communism is a little bit like ketchup. They're both red, and at least when I put some on my daughter's plate, it tends to just sort of end up all over the place. She finds any reason to put ketchup on any number of items on her plate. So the United States' policy in response to socialism, communism, was containment. The United States' goal was to stop the spread of communist ketchup in any way possible. This was a legitimate fear that communism was going to spread worldwide, partly because that was what Karl Marx had originally envisioned. Marx talked about how workers of the world would unite together in various unions, and then how they would lead these revolutions. Yes, it was in various countries, but it would be a worldwide movement that would ultimately lead to the radical redistribution of wealth and the downfall of the bourgeoisie. In what different ways was the Cold War expressed? First, I want to talk about Europe. Europe was split into competing blocs. There was the bloc in Western Europe that was following the leadership of the United States, following the principles of democratic capitalism. And then you had the bloc in Eastern Europe that was supported by the Soviet Union and following the principles of socialism, communism. There was a metaphorical iron curtain that divided these two blocs. Here we see a cartoon showing Winston Churchill trying to peek under the Iron Curtain. The suggestion is that it had been established there by Joseph Stalin. In addition to a metaphorical curtain, actual real barriers were put up between the communist world and the capitalist world. For example, a wall was built in Berlin. Remember, Berlin was a city that was divided. It was located entirely within that region of communist East Germany. But the city of Berlin itself was divided up, and so there were portions of West Berlin that were originally occupation zones of the United States, Britain, and France. An actual wall was constructed to mainly prevent people from East Berlin and from East Germany from coming over into West Berlin. Communist governments rose to power in Eastern Europe, supported by the Soviet Union. Those were East Germany, Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria. And they essentially were run by puppet leaders. The Soviet Union were behind the curtain, pulling the strings, providing both financial, military, and political support. In Western Europe, the United States was playing an increasingly large role. One of the major figures in that was George Marshall, who devised a plan following World War II to help boost the economy of those Western European countries by providing a significant amount of aid. So here we see a map showing the money the United States provided to various Western European countries in aid, including Greece. Early in the Cold War, there was civil war that had broken out in Greece between pro-communist and anti-communist forces. The United States was trying to ensure, by providing a lot of money to Greece, that they would be able to ensure that communism didn't spread to places like Greece and Turkey. So this was known as the Marshall Plan. It was a plan to aid Western Europe in its economic recovery after World War II. So while the stated purpose of the Marshall Plan was to help rebuild these Western European economies following World War II, the read between the lines purpose of the Marshall Plan was also to help stop the spread of communism. The thinking was, if there was increased problems and economic anxiety, the fear is that communism was more likely to take hold in states where those conditions were present. A second way in which the Cold War is expressed is through the formation of two major alliances. And those were NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which initially was focused mostly on this North Atlantic region, right? That's why it's called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the Warsaw Pact, which included initially mainly the Soviet Union and those Eastern European countries. Now, over time, NATO would expand to include many countries in Latin America, parts of Africa, Southeast Asia. And the Warsaw Pact would grow to include some more countries in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Africa. The United States and the Soviet Union both formed these strategic alliances, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and the Warsaw Pact. Both of these alliances are based on mutual defense treaties, which means that if one of the countries in blue is attacked, then each of the partners of NATO have pledged to come to their mutual defense. And same thing went for the Warsaw Pact. Notice also there are a lot of countries here in gray. They were especially in regions where countries were just starting to emerge from colonial control, right? This is post-World War II. Decolonization is going to start to take place in Africa, South Asia. We're going to spend more time on this in the next unit. But there are a number of countries who form a third option in the Cold War. And this was called the non-aligned movement. So these newly independent nations in Africa and Asia, they joined a non-aligned movement, an attempt to stay neutral, an attempt to avoid the entanglements, an attempt also to try and derive benefits from both sides of this Cold War struggle. They were, on the one hand, talking to the United States, saying, oh, give us, support and aid, and we'll be on your side. And then turning to the Soviets and saying, provide us with support and aid, and we'll take your side. The leaders of the non-aligned movement, the ones that formed it, were individuals like Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Kwame Nkrumah, leader of Ghana, Gamal Nasser of Egypt, and he just needs one name. He's like the Beyonce of world history, Sukarno of Indonesia. And we'll spend some more time on these individuals in our next unit on decolonization. The third way in which the Cold War was expressed was through various proxy wars. The first one I want to focus on in this video was the Korean War. And the Korean War would be fought between the communist-led North and the anti-communist forces in the South. After World War II, the Soviets were in the North. The United States military was positioned in the South, and it remained this way from the end of the war in 1945 until 1950. In 1950, the Communist North invaded South Korea. This was led by the North Korean leader at the time, Kim Il-sung. And if he looks familiar, it's probably because he is the father of Kim Jong-il, who was the leader of North Korea until recently when he passed away and was succeeded by his son, Kim Jong-un. Oh, all the Kims. They're so adorable. You could just squeeze their cheeks. So what should the United States do in response? They're following the goal of containment, right? Keep that ketchup in the bottle. Then the United States needed to act in response to this aggression from the communist North. But there was also a lot of concern in the United States that, right, we'd just gotten out of a war 5 years earlier. So should this just be an action that the United States takes on its own? The United States decided that what the Communist North did was a violation of some of the principles of the United Nations, which we'll talk more about later. The United Nations is a new international body that had formed following World War II. The United States gets the United Nations to agree to take a military action. Led by the United States, the United Nations forces then pushed the North Koreans back into northern Korea and even all the way up to what is essentially the border of China. Who's going to be nervous about this? It's the Chinese. It's Mao Zedong. This is the early 1950s. Mao Zedong and the communists in China had just taken power in 1949. So now they are feeling the threat of democratic forces coming across the Korean peninsula. And so in response, China, led by Mao Zedong, sends troops to the aid of the North Koreans. And they're going to push the UN troops back down to the 38th parallel. A line was drawn at that 38th parallel between North Korea and South Korea, and the war essentially ended in a stalemate. And it's remained that way for the last 70 years. This is the DMZ. It's a zone at the border between North and South Korea, and you can see the soldiers from the North essentially just staring down the soldier from the South. Not to say that they don't do things to one another and essentially make each other mad. For instance, in South Korea, one of the things they used as a weapon was just an entire wall of speakers, which they try and pump messages into the communist North. They use the most potent weapon in the world today, which is BTS K-pop. Recently, some of the tensions that had existed between the North and the South had started to kind of cool off a little bit as Kim Jong-un met with the leader of South Korea, met with President Trump. But we're starting to see tensions beginning to slowly rise again as North Korea has engaged in more belligerent talk in the last few years. So the big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video are, first, what are the major causes of the Cold War? And then second, in what different ways was the Cold War expressed? In the next video, we'll take on a few different ways the Cold War was expressed in wars like the Vietnam War and the war in Afghanistan. And we'll also talk about the nuclear arms race. And then we'll start to talk about how communism ultimately collapsed. As always, thanks for watching.